Gut inflammation is a combination of two things. We have one side that talks all about the microbiome, but the truth is we just don't know a ton there. Then you have another side that talks about the actual gut barrier integrity, like the lining of our gut. We know more about that world because that's a little bit more, dare I say, mechanical, unless, well, I don't want to call bacteria fringe, but come on, we barely know anything about what's going on in our gut with bacteria. Gut inflammation is when you have so much in the way of bad bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, that contain what is called an endotoxin lipopolysaccharide. When you have a lot of that, but then your gut lining is also disrupted, so those bad bacteria that contain lipopolysaccharide get through and into your bloodstream, leading to systemic inflammation and definitely localized gut inflammation. So just because you have a quote-unquote unhealthy gut doesn't necessarily mean you have gut inflammation, but it is a high likelihood that you do. So let's talk about the first thing that we see a lot of literature surrounding, and that's going to be the Western diet and how this impacts directly what is called lipopolysaccharides in the gut. So this study on the Western diet was published in Gastroenterology, and it took a look at a Western diet versus a sort of prudent, cleaner diet for 1 month. So the way the macronutrients were set up, the Western diet ate 40% of their calories from fat, okay, half of which was saturated fat, so about 20% total saturated fat. 40% carbohydrates with a good amount of refined carbs, and 20% protein. The cleaner diet ate 20% fat and only about 5 to 6% total saturated fat. They ate 60% carbohydrates and 20% protein, and they had about 31% total fiber in their carbohydrate makeup. So overall, just a much cleaner diet. Well, what was interesting is the calories were matched, so they ate the same amount of calories. Their blood markers didn't change a whole lot, like their glucose levels, their lipids, cholesterol. None of that really changed much in the matter of a month. But one thing that did change significantly was the level of serum lipopolysaccharides. It went up 71%, a 71% increase in lipopolysaccharides, gut inflammation, in the Western diet group, and a 31% decrease in the prudent diet group. So the cleaner diet led to less lipopolysaccharides getting into the bloodstream. So the actual endotoxin effect of the diet was significant, even though the blood markers hadn't really registered a change yet. So when it comes down to things starting in the gut, I don't know, maybe Hippocrates was right when he said, quote unquote, all disease starts in the gut 2,000 years ago, right? But let's break down specifics of the Western diet. I want to talk about refined carbohydrates. This is really interesting because there's a study that directly compares equal calories with refined carbs versus whole food carbohydrates. Pretty astonishing results. It was published in the American Journal of Nutrition, and they had subjects eat at maintenance level, maintenance calories. Again, normal diet. The only difference was refined carbohydrates versus whole food carbohydrates. The gut bacteria changes were so significant that they were actually able to see a monumental change in what are called short-chain fatty acids, so the actual byproduct of bacteria that help us with potential healing, they help us with glucose modulation, they help us with everything related to the gut and related to our body. But they also saw a noticeable increase in inflammatory cytokines like IL-6. Really, really interesting. So there was a direct line with intestinal inflammation, bad bacteria, and systemic inflammation just by switching from whole food carbs to refined carbs. The whole food carbs did not have this effect. So it's just kind of wild. I mean, we're told that refined carbohydrates are kind of benign and that it's just calories, but I don't know. Seems like having it in their whole food form might be better, especially when it comes down to the gut. Number 2 is really interesting. It was a lack of animal protein. This is wild because a lot of people will disagree on this, but if you start to draw some inference from some of the literature, you can really see it. Okay, so glutamine is an amino acid that's predominantly in meat and dairy protein. Okay, really not going to find it in plant protein too much. So with glutamine, this is a direct fuel for the cells that line the gut. It's literal fuel for them. They eat glutamine. So when they don't have glutamine, those cells will degrade, and you will have more propensity for those lipopolysaccharides to leak right through the lining of the gut. There was a study published in Experimental and Therapeutic Medicine that published a meta-analysis, and it found that glutamine supplementation ended up increasing the overall levels of junction proteins and increased the efficiency of those junction proteins, and therefore ended up driving down CRP, drove down IL-6, increased anti-inflammatory IL-2, so it had an anti-inflammatory effect, but here's what's most important, is it decreased the amount of intestinal inflammation and decreased the amount of lipopolysaccharides leaking out of the gut into the bloodstream, just by adding glutamine supplementation. Not saying you need to go out and supplement glutamine, you can for this particular case, but in reality, just eating enough good quality animal protein is going to get you glutamine. It's when people are kind of doing these diets where they just start getting rid of all the nutritious animal protein, and they're also adding refined stuff in, and they're also adding all this other garbage in and replacing whole foods. That's when they start running into a problem. Surprise, surprise. The next one is quite interesting. It's not getting enough fiber. Now, we know that in the standard American diet and a Western diet, there's just not a lot of fiber. It comes right back down to those refined starches again. There's a study published in Genome Medicine, took a look at 307 people. Flat out, those that were on a higher fiber diet in a dose-dependent fashion had less overall inflammation, less CRP, and better shifts in their microbiome associated with that overall. So we know that fiber and we know that protein are important. We know that getting rid of some of the refined starches and replacing them with whole foods is important. But fiber seems to be a common denominator with the whole food piece. If you go out and you eat a refined Pop-Tart, do you think you're getting much fiber? No. But if you go out and you eat a bowl of sweet potatoes, maybe some brown rice and black beans, say whatever you want about plant foods. If you eat that, you're getting a lot of fiber that has some beneficial effect. One of the things I've recommended for people that are trying to get more fiber and kind of more whole foods, I usually do a combination of eating animal protein. I'll still have a whey protein shake here and there. And then I'll also use a plant-based shake, specifically in this case from SunWarrior, because they have one that has fiber, has digestive enzymes in it, has probiotics in it as well. So it's a really gut-friendly protein shake. But even for me, I am not a vegan. I'm not a plant-based person. I eat a lot of meat personally, but I find that having a plant-based shake also gives me the fiber and gives me what I'm looking for as far as like full spectrum of nutrition that I may not get in other ways. Because I'm not solely an animal-based person, and I'm not solely a plant-based person. But SunWarrior, their active line, their protein is really beneficial. I treat it almost like a food because it's a little bit more, I don't know, it has more body to it with the fiber and the enzymes and the other components. And they're also using pumpkin seed protein, which is a very rich, very solid, wide spectrum protein as far as a plant-based is concerned. And they use a nice combination to get you all the essential aminos that you need, including glutamine. So doing this alongside with maybe eating some animal protein is hugely beneficial. I put a link down below that can save you 20% off of that. Highly recommended it. Tastes amazing. That link is in the top line of the description underneath this video. Next up is a triple whammy. It's margarine, peanut butter, and Oreos. Okay, not necessarily all those together, but there's a common denominator in those foods. It's hydrogenated oils or trans fats. Margarine, throw it away. Peanut butter, you can find options that don't have trans fats. Oreos, the white filling is pretty much pure trans fats, hydrogenated oil. We know from large-scale human literature that trans fats are bad. It's the one thing we all agree on, no matter what diet camp you sit in, is bad. This next one's kind of fun because it's something that you could easily add in. If you look at the Western diet lacks a lot of good spices. And I know this sounds funny, but there's some good evidence surrounding curcumin. If you just wanted to add turmeric curcumin to your food, that alone seems to have some interesting effects. Now, full disclaimer, I'm going into in vitro land with this one. But when you look at my videos, you see that I always have a mix of randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, meta-analysis. Then I go down the rodent model route, and then I go the in vitro route. We look at all of them. The study was published in the American Journal of Cell Physiology, and they took intestinal cells and they pre-treated them with curcumin. And what they found is when they pre-treated these cells with curcumin, it actually blocked the negative effects of lipopolysaccharides. It blocked the inflammatory effect. It also decreased the expression of myosin light chain kinase, which is Greek, not really, but it sounds like Greek, for essentially something that triggers the gut barrier to start breaking down. So when you have that elevated, it's problematic. We decrease that, and the gut is able to stay sturdier. So although it's in vitro research, there's a lot of good evidence from an inflammatory side or anti-inflammatory side that curcumin is beneficial. So it could be something to add into the mix. I mean, you do see a lot of the regions that have a lot of these spices do typically seem to live pretty long, healthy lives. So maybe adding that into the mix isn't such a bad idea. The next one is fried foods. There was a study that was published in Diabetes Care. It took a look at 117 people. They just had them consume fried foods, like fried meat specifically, 4 times per week. Just having fried meat 4 times per week had a monumental effect on their gut microbiome and their inflammation. They found that their serum lipopolysaccharide levels, the gram-negative bacteria that got through the gut, skyrocketed, increased dramatically, and they increased in tandem with the IL-6 and the tumor necrosis factor. So basically, they saw an increase in lipopolysaccharides, bad gut bacteria, and a sort of subsequent increase in the inflammation that comes as a result. Not to mention there was a decrease in what they called bacterial richness, so it kind of degraded the overall effectiveness of the gut bacteria as well. Which kind of leads me into the next one. We don't have a lot of fermented foods in the standard American diet or in the Western diet. There's a lot of regions of the world that still eat a lot of fermented foods. Like Russia eats a lot of fermented foods. They have some of the lowest blood sugar levels in the world. Okay, then you look at regions like Japan, you look at some of these regions that have a tremendously long life expectancy. One of the common denominators with a lot of them is probiotic-rich foods, a lot of fermented veggies, fermented foods in general. There was a study published in Frontiers in Immunology that wasn't any small study. It looked at 26 different randomized controlled trials. And they found that simply adding probiotics in, whether it's from supplement or from food, had a huge impact when it came down to lipopolysaccharides and overall just gut barrier health too. The study demonstrated that increasing probiotic levels, again, through food or even supplements, but hopefully you're doing it through food as much as possible, decreased zonulin levels. Now, zonulin is increased when we generally are unhealthy, right? Like zonulin triggers the tight junctions in our gut to break down. Right? So if you have high levels of zonulin, you probably have what's called a leaky gut, which is an over-marketed term, but it's a real thing, right? Intestinal permeability is more the real clinical term. So when zonulin's high, intestinal permeability is high. If you lower zonulin, the tight junctions kind of repair themselves. So it's interesting that our gut microbiome and eating fermented foods, it actually can impact what's happening on the outside of our like intestinal wall as well, or the inside shell of our intestinal wall. So adding some things like Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, some of my favorites like kimchi. I'm also a big fan of kefir. I'm a big fan of any kind of fermented stuff. I literally will drink pickle juice. I mean, just the fermentation, the probiotic effect is very good. And lastly, there was a study published in Medicine, took a look at 130,000 people, and it investigated the effects of soda. They found that those that drank soda, when they looked at 130,000 people, had the highest instance of Crohn's disease when they were looking at people that suffered with intestinal inflammation and issues. Their Crohn's bouts, their instance of Crohn's disease, significantly higher with soda, even over coffee and alcohol, which is super, super wild. So it seems like sugar is a huge driving factor for intestinal issues and inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's. The fun fact out of this same study with 130,000 people, those that drank more tea, green tea and black tea, had the lowest instances of Crohn's, even if they were maybe people that had it in the past. Tea drinkers, less irritable bowel syndrome and Crohn's. Soda drinkers, more. Is it because of the soda, or is it because those that typically drink soda are probably also eating refined carbs? We cannot always look at this and say, correlation equals causation, but it's a lot of data to look at. So out of all of this, what is the takeaway here? I know it sounds sort of lame to say eat whole foods and things like that, but sort of my staples that I would say is occasionally taking a break from food, not grazing all day so your gut actually has a break. Adding fermented foods is an easy one, right? Everyone loves some fermented foods. You could have some yogurt, cottage cheese, have some kimchi, have some sauerkraut, have some kefir, have something like that. Fermented beef, even things like that. That can be good, right? Okay. Add some tea into the mix. That seems to be hugely beneficial. Antioxidant effects, you name it. If you're gonna eat carbohydrates, just eat them in their whole food form. Even if they're higher glycemic, right? Even if you're eating a potato, it's less about the glycemic response and it's more about the fact that a refined carb is pretty darn gnarly. We don't really know what the heck it's doing. Adding more fiber into your diet. And you don't even need to go crazy with it. Just adding a little bit more incrementally, adding some chia seeds into that yogurt that we talked about. These are hugely beneficial for the gut. And we're not talking about just increasing your gut bacteria because it's cool. We're talking about literally reducing inflammation that can impact your joints, impact your mood, impact your life, your sleep, your sex, everything that you could possibly imagine as life. I'll see you tomorrow.